If you were living in Mesopotamia, say, in the great cities of Ur, Babylon, or Nineveh, you would not have thought much about your teeth until they hurt. The very concept of dentistry, as we understand it today, simply did not exist. Yet the people of Mesopotamia, living between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers thousands of years ago, dealt with the same frustrating human problems we do: toothaches, cavities, abscesses, and the slow, grinding wear of teeth caused by a lifetime of coarse bread and gritty meals. Their solutions, however, would feel far closer to torture than treatment for any modern listener drifting to sleep. Imagine this: you wake up in a mud brick home, with the sound of goats outside and the smell of bread baking on a clay hearth. For weeks, a dull pain has been building in one of your molars. It radiates into your jaw, and when you chew the barley bread, the ache grows unbearable. You tell your family. They look worried. Everyone knows what that pain means. In Mesopotamian culture, toothaches were not caused by sugar or poor hygiene but by demons. The most infamous of these was the so-called tooth worm. This was not a metaphor in their minds but a literal worm believed to burrow inside your gums, feeding on the root of your tooth. Clay tablets dating back more than 4,000 years contain incantations describing this worm. One of the oldest surviving dental texts is written in cuneiform, recording both medical recipes and magical spells meant to drive the worm out. The tablet tells us a myth: when the gods created all the creatures of the world, the tooth worm begged for a place to live. The gods allowed it to live in teeth and gums, feeding on blood and marrow. From this myth emerged the belief that toothache was a supernatural infestation. The cure, therefore, was not drilling or filling, but exorcism. You might have been taken to an asapul, a priest exorcist, rather than a healer. He would recite long, monotonous chants over your head, invoking the gods Ea and Shamash to drive the worm away. The ritual involved burning incense, whispering spells, and pressing amulets to your cheek. Sometimes a small figurine of the worm was made out of clay and ceremonially destroyed, symbolizing the worm's defeat. This was Mesopotamian dentistry in its earliest form, a mixture of fear, faith, and ritual. But the Mesopotamians were not entirely without practical remedies. Alongside the magical spells, there were also recipes for mouth rinses and poultices. Ancient medical tablets describe applying crushed herbs, oils, and even beer to the affected tooth. Beer, of course, was not just for drinking, it was antiseptic and numbing, at least to a small degree. Other treatments included placing a mixture of honey and herbs onto the gums, honey serving as a natural antibacterial. Yet while these may have provided temporary relief, none of them solved the root of the problem. The harsh reality was that Mesopotamian bread was filled with tiny particles of stone and grit from grinding grain in stone mills. Over time, this ground down teeth, exposing nerves and leading to excruciating infections. Without antibiotics, an abscessed tooth could swell until the infection spread into the bloodstream. Many likely died quietly of what we would call dental sepsis. Archaeological evidence backs this up. Skulls unearthed from Mesopotamian burial sites show heavy wear on teeth, cavities, and jaw infections. Some even show signs of crude surgical attempts. In a few, there are traces of drilling, small circular holes bored into teeth. These were not clean dental drills like today but hand drills, the same sort used for woodworking or making bead holes. It is unclear if this was done as treatment for toothache, or perhaps even as part of ritual trepanation, boring into the tooth to release the supposed worm. The thought alone is enough to make your jaw clench as you drift off. Imagine lying on a reed mat, your family holding you down, as a healer. brings a bow drill toward your face. The sound of wood scraping, the smell of burnt tooth enamel, the pain unbearable, and all with no anesthetic but a gulp of strong beer. Despite the brutality, these practices hint at something important, the beginning of rational medicine. The Mesopotamians combined magical thinking with real observation. They noticed that honey soothed wounds. They noticed that certain herbs dulled pain. They recognized that drilling into a swollen area sometimes released pressure. These fragments of knowledge were stepping stones toward future dentistry. But for the ordinary person, there was little comfort in that. Day-to-day life was full of risks for teeth. Bread, beer, dried dates, and coarse vegetables all wore them down. Chewing was not just painful but dangerous when abscesses swelled. In a society where survival was already a daily challenge, floods, droughts, wars, and famine, the added misery of toothache could feel like a curse from the gods. And so, many relied not just on the exorcist but on amulets. Small pendants inscribed with protective charms were worn around the neck, meant to keep the worm away. Some had tiny depictions of open mouths with symbols meant to bind the creature inside. Yet even with all this, the pain often won. Teeth would rot, gums would swell, and eventually the tooth might loosen and fall out on its own. In that sense, nature performed its own kind of dentistry. But this came at a high cost: infection, difficulty eating, and the slow decline of health. The dullness of these details, the clay tablets with half magical, half practical instructions, the monotonous chanting of priests, the grinding pain of coarse bread, is what shaped Mesopotamian life in ways we rarely think about. Toothache was not a small inconvenience. It was a constant, gnawing presence, shaping belief systems, family rituals, and even survival itself, and so you can picture it, lying under the flickering light of an oil lamp, your jaw throbbing, while someone murmurs to the gods in hopes of driving out a worm that never existed. You do not know about bacteria, cavities, or nerves. You only know that the pain feels alive inside you, and perhaps, in some strange way, you believe the priests are right. But here is the question that remains as we close this section: did the belief in the tooth worm help people endure their suffering, or did it condemn them to centuries of needless torture? In the last section, you heard about the mythical tooth worm and the painful, ritual-based cures that the people of Mesopotamia endured. But the story of Mesopotamian dentistry is not limited to myths and incantations. If you look closer, through the dusty clay tablets and worn bones of excavated skeletons, you find a complicated picture, a people balancing faith, crude medical knowledge, and the slow beginnings of empirical observation. To understand Mesopotamian dentistry, you first need to understand Mesopotamian medicine more broadly. The healers of this region, active from around 3000 BCE to 500 BCE, operated within two categories: the Asipu, the exorcists, who dealt with demons and curses through ritual, and the Asu, who were closer to what we would recognize as physicians, prescribing herbal treatments and practical remedies. Together, they created a hybrid system where illness was both a supernatural affliction and a physical imbalance. Dentistry, if it could be called that, fell directly in the middle of these two approaches. A patient with a throbbing jaw might first consult the Asipu, who would chant long prayers, recite the myth of the tooth worm, and burn incense. But if the pain persisted, the patient might next see the Asu, who would provide a paste of herbs and oils. These might include willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, a primitive version of aspirin, or cloves and other aromatic plants believed to dull pain. The remedies were written down on clay tablets in careful, wedge-shaped cuneiform, forming some of the earliest medical texts in history. One such text, translated from Akkadian, prescribes: "If a man's tooth aches, ye shall crush henbane seed in beer, let him rinse his mouth and spit it out." Henbane contains hallucinogenic and narcotic properties, so while it did not cure the tooth, it may indeed have dulled the pain, though at the cost of dizziness, confusion, or even delirium. Other remedies used mustard seeds, fig tree bark, and vinegar, all substances that could burn or numb tissue. But as practical as these remedies sound, none addressed the deeper cause of cavities or abscesses. And so, the cycle of pain, ritual, and makeshift treatment continued, often until the patient either lost the tooth or died of infection. Archaeology provides haunting evidence of this reality. In cemeteries across Mesopotamia, skulls show teeth ground down almost flat from years of chewing gritty bread. Microscopic analysis reveals scratches in the enamel from stone fragments left in flour. Some teeth are worn to the pulp, where the nerve once lay exposed, a slow torture experienced over years. Abscesses leave behind dark cavities in the jawbone, silent reminders of pain that likely ended only with death. Yet there are also signs that some individuals attempted more radical interventions. A handful of teeth recovered from ancient Mesopotamian sites show marks that look like deliberate drilling. These are small, circular holes, almost identical in size to those made by bow drills used in woodworking. Whether this was an attempt to relieve pain by letting out infection or an effort to destroy the supposed tooth worm, we cannot know for sure. But the effect must have been horrifying: bone and enamel shrieking under pressure, pain exploding with every twist of the drill, the smell of heated tooth filling the air. In some cases, archaeologists have found traces of resin inside these drilled teeth. Could it be that Mesopotamian healers tried to fill cavities with resin or bitumen, the sticky black tar common in their land? If so, this would represent an astonishingly early attempt at restorative dentistry. Imagine lying still as a healer packs your hollow tooth with resin, sticky and bitter, pressing it down with a reed stick. The substance may have sealed the hole temporarily, but it likely trapped infection inside, leading to greater agony later. All of this took place within a broader worldview where illness was never just physical. The gods were always present. For example, the god Nergal, associated with plague and disease, was often blamed for persistent illness. The goddess Gula, patron of healing, was invoked in prayers for relief. Shrines to Gula contained offerings, dog figurines, as dogs were sacred to her, left by those suffering from pain, including toothache. Thus, a person might have combined drilling or poultices with prayer at a temple, hoping divine favor would heal what human hands could not. Daily life ensured that dental suffering was widespread. Agriculture in Mesopotamia relied on grinding barley, wheat, and emmer into flour with stone querns. Over time, the stone wore down, leaving particles mixed into the flour. Every bite of bread wore away enamel, turning teeth into flat, brittle stubs. Children began the slow process of dental erosion early, and by adulthood, many had lost teeth or suffered chronic infections. Dental misery was not a rare curse, it was a shared condition across nearly every family, woven into the rhythm of survival. The monotony of Mesopotamian meals only made things worse. Bread and beer were staples, consumed daily, sometimes exclusively when famine struck. Beer was drunk thick and unfiltered, filled with plant debris, often sipped through reed straws to avoid swallowing solids. It may have been safer than water, but it did nothing to protect teeth. Beer's acidity could erode enamel further, while sugar from dates and honey, occasionally mixed in, provided fuel for bacterial growth. And yet, in the heart of this suffering, you glimpse something extraordinary, the beginnings of systematic medical thought. The Mesopotamians recorded not only incantations but symptoms, causes, and remedies. They noted patterns: pain that worsened when chewing, swelling that spread to the cheek, teeth that loosened over time. They experimented with plants and minerals, combining observation with ritual. The very act of writing these things down, of cataloging human misery, was a step toward science, even if science was still centuries away. For the patient lying awake at night with a swollen jaw, though, this distinction was meaningless. What mattered was the pain, gnawing, constant, inescapable. Relief might come in the form of a bitter herb, a spell whispered in the dark, or the crude hand of a healer with a drill. None offered true escape, only distraction, only delay. And so, as we consider Mesopotamian dentistry, one haunting thought lingers: did the first experiments with drilling teeth and sealing them with resin bring hope, or did they only deepen the torture? By now, you have traveled through the grim landscape of Mesopotamian dentistry, the tooth worm myth, the chants of exorcists, the herbal poultices of physicians, and the crude experiments with drilling and resin. In this final section, we move beyond the treatments themselves to consider their wider consequences: how the misery of dental pain shaped Mesopotamian society, religion, and even the earliest stirrings of scientific thought. To understand the cultural weight of dentistry, you must picture the daily reality of Mesopotamian life. Imagine yourself in Babylon around 1800 BCE, the city bustling with merchants, scribes, and artisans. The ziggurat towers above the streets, its steps crowded with priests. The markets are filled with clay tablets, wool, dates, and fish hauled from the rivers. And among the voices calling out prices, there are always whispers of illness. A swollen cheek. A neighbor wincing while eating, a friend losing weight because chewing has become too painful. These were ordinary sights. Toothache was a shared human burden, silently binding families and communities together in the shadow of suffering. It is easy to forget, in a world of dentists and painkillers, how much dental pain once dictated survival. A bad tooth could determine whether you could chew bread in the middle of famine. It could dictate whether you could drink beer or swallow dried dates, the staple calories of your household. For a soldier, a tooth infection spreading into fever might remove him from the battlefield. For a farmer, a jaw swollen with pus might mean missing the crucial days of sowing or harvesting. Teeth, so small and often overlooked, could shift the balance between survival and starvation. This helps explain why the Mesopotamians turned to religion as much as medicine. When pain governed life so powerfully, it was only natural to see it as the will of the gods. Prayers for healing were not just whispered in the home but carved into tablets and left at temples. The goddess Gula, whom you met earlier, was invoked in countless healing rituals. Small dog figurines, her sacred symbol, have been excavated in vast numbers, offered by the suffering in exchange for relief. In this way, dental pain contributed to the constant flow of offerings and devotion that sustained Mesopotamian religious life. But there is another angle, quieter and perhaps more intriguing: the way dental problems pushed Mesopotamian healers toward observation and experimentation. The cycle of pain was too relentless to ignore. The tooth worm myth may have been repeated for centuries, but alongside it, healers were taking notes, cataloging symptoms, and testing substances. They compared cases, observed results, and built a body of knowledge, however primitive. This habit of recording, even of boring, everyday toothache, was part of the broader Mesopotamian project of writing. Everything down: grain harvests, trade accounts, star movements, and medical conditions alike. In fact, Some historians argue that dentistry in Mesopotamia may have been one of the first areas where observation began to challenge myth. The discovery that honey reduced swelling, or that willow bark dulled pain, hinted at a world where causes and cures might be natural, not divine. The practice of drilling, crude though it was, suggested an intuition, that relief might come from physically altering the tooth, not just reciting spells. These tiny steps were not yet science, but they laid the groundwork for it. Still, for the ordinary sufferer, this was little comfort. The drilling was agony, the herbs bitter, the prayers uncertain. Most endured tooth pain until the tooth fell out or infection claimed them. And yet, even this slow decay had meaning. In Mesopotamian burial sites, the skulls of the dead tell silent stories. Worn teeth speak of decades of grinding grain. Missing molars reveal the collapse of jaws to infection. Resin-packed cavities suggest desperate attempts to preserve chewing ability. Each skull is a record not only of an individual life but of an entire culture wrestling with the fragility of the human body. Consider, too, the broader symbolism of teeth. In many ancient cultures, teeth were linked with strength and vitality. To lose teeth was to lose part of oneself, to appear older, weaker, closer to death. A man missing teeth might struggle in his work or appear diminished in status. A woman with missing front teeth might be considered less desirable in marriage. Thus, dental health, or its decline, was not just physical but social. The pain of toothache was private, but the loss of teeth was public, visible to all. Now imagine the impact on community rituals. A feast in Mesopotamia, perhaps during a festival to Ishtar or a royal celebration, would have been filled with food, roasted lamb, bread, figs, and beer. But for many, such feasts were not joyous. Chewing was painful. Some would sip only broth or soak their bread in beer until it softened. The act of eating together, meant to bind the community, also reminded everyone of their vulnerabilities. The sight of elders with missing teeth, or neighbors grimacing with every bite, reinforced the shared reality of decay and suffering. And yet, in a strange way, this suffering helped build resilience. Families cared for one another during illness, preparing soft foods, assisting with rituals, and seeking healers together. Communities shared knowledge of herbs and remedies, passing down recipes from generation to generation. Even the most monotonous chant of a priest offered comfort through familiarity. Pain, while isolating, also connected. If you trace this thread further, you see that Mesopotamian dentistry, however brutal, was part of the larger story of how humans began to confront the fragility of the body. Before modern medicine, pain was not an aberration but a constant companion. Every small advance, whether identifying a useful herb or drilling into a tooth, represented not only a struggle against suffering but also a step toward understanding. The monotony of toothache, endured across centuries, quietly shaped the foundations of medical practice. As you lie back now, perhaps you can imagine the flicker of an oil lamp in a Mesopotamian home. A man sits with his hand pressed to his cheek, his eyes closed in exhaustion. His wife prepares a paste of herbs, grinding them slowly, while a child watches silently, knowing this ritual well. Outside, the sounds of donkeys and traders drift through the night air. Somewhere in the city, a priest chants the ancient words of the toothworm myth, his voice rising and falling like the tide of pain itself. The man does not know if the herbs will help. He does not know if the gods will listen. All he knows is that tomorrow, he must still rise, work the fields, and chew the bread, no matter how much it hurts, and here lies the final reflection, the story of Mesopotamian dentistry is not only about crude tools and magical thinking. It is about endurance. Ordinary people lived with constant pain, yet they survived, built cities, wrote the first laws, and studied the stars. Their teeth may have rotted, but their civilization endured. In this, there is a quiet lesson: history is not made only by battles and kings but by countless individuals enduring the small, grinding miseries of life, misery that shaped their beliefs, their rituals, and their slow steps toward knowledge. So as we close the first story, one question remains to linger in your thoughts: did the persistence of suffering push Mesopotamians toward progress, or did it keep them bound to myths that prolonged their agony? When you think of the Roman Empire, you probably picture legions marching in gleaming armor, aqueducts carrying water across valleys, or senators wrapped in white togas debating in the Forum. What you likely do not picture is the ordinary Roman lying awake at night with a throbbing toothache, dreading the crude hands of a tooth puller. Yet dental pain was as much a part of Roman life as gladiatorial games or public baths, and in many ways, it reveals the hidden realities of an empire that prided itself on power and order. By the 1st century CE, Rome was a sprawling superpower stretching from Britain to Egypt. Its cities were filled with marble temples, bustling markets, and crowded tenements. But beneath this grandeur lay daily struggles, and dental misery was among them. Roman bread, much like the Mesopotamian loaves before it, was ground with stone mills that left tiny fragments embedded in the flour. Over years, these fragments wore teeth down, exposing nerves. Combine this with sweet wine, honeyed cakes, and the Roman love of dried fruits, and you had a recipe for cavities, abscesses, and tooth loss. For the wealthy, there were occasional comforts. Physicians, trained in the writings of Hippocrates and Galen, offered remedies. Galen himself, one of the most influential Roman doctors, wrote about dental pain, suggesting poultices of herbs and opium to dull the ache. He believed toothaches could be caused by humors trapped in the gums, thick fluids that needed to be balanced or drawn out. His solutions were often messy and inconsistent, but they reflected the Roman desire to systematize medicine, to explain even the agony of a tooth within the broader framework of humoral theory. For ordinary people, however, the reality was much harsher. Toothaches were usually treated not by physicians but by tooth pullers, a rough profession, more craft than science. These men, sometimes working in markets or on street corners, advertised their trade openly. They carried iron forceps, primitive but effective, and their solution to nearly any dental problem was simple: yank the tooth out. There was no anesthetic beyond perhaps a gulp of wine. The patient would sit on a stool, head braced, while the puller gripped the offending tooth and twisted until it tore free. Screams and blood were part of the expected soundtrack. Surviving Roman medical instruments give us a chilling glimpse into these procedures. Archaeologists have uncovered iron forceps, long and curved, designed to grip teeth tightly. There are also dental probes, needles for lancing abscesses, and even scalpel-like tools for cutting into gums. Some of these instruments look disturbingly similar to modern dental tools, yet they were used without sterilization, anesthesia, or much understanding of infection. Imagine the smell of iron, the taste of blood, and the searing pain of a molar being torn from your jaw with only a marketplace crowd for company. And yet, in their own way, Roman tooth pullers provided a kind of service. They offered relief from unbearable pain, however brutal the method. To suffer with a rotting tooth was to risk infection spreading into the jaw or blood, leading to fever and death. Extraction, though traumatic, at least ended the immediate agony. The Romans also inherited older traditions of magical thinking. Some believed that toothache could be eased by charms or incantations. Amulets inscribed with prayers to various gods were worn around the neck. One curious superstition involved touching a tooth with the bone of a frog or even wearing a frog amulet as protection. Another involved whispering your pain to a small object, such as a pebble, and throwing it away, symbolically casting the pain out of your body. These rituals, though quaint to us, reveal how desperate people were to escape the relentless torment of their teeth. But while the average Roman endured crude extractions, the wealthy elite could afford more elaborate care. Some aristocrats had access to dentists, specialized practitioners who focused on oral health. Evidence suggests they attempted fillings using lead or other metals. Lead, of course, was plentiful in Rome and used in everything from plumbing to cosmetics. Unfortunately, it was also toxic. A filling of lead might temporarily plug a cavity, but over time it could poison the patient slowly, adding another layer of suffering to an already miserable problem. Despite these grim realities, dentistry did play a role in the broader Roman fascination with appearance and status. Teeth were not only functional but also cosmetic. Roman poets and satirists frequently mocked those with rotten or missing teeth. To have a clean, full set of teeth was a sign of youth, beauty, and vitality. Women, in particular, were pressured to maintain attractive smiles. Some sources even suggest the use of tooth powders made from crushed bones, oyster shells, or charcoal to clean and whiten teeth. Mixed with herbs or vinegar, these powders were rubbed onto the teeth with cloth. Though abrasive and damaging over time, they created the illusion of cleanliness and refinement. Roman burial sites confirm this obsession. Skulls have been found with gold wires threaded through teeth, evidence of early attempts at dental prosthetics. These wires may have been used to stabilize loose teeth or to hold false teeth, carved from ivory or bone, in place. Such procedures were rare and likely reserved for the wealthy, but they show a surprising level of ingenuity. Imagine a Roman aristocrat smiling at a banquet, his teeth gleaming with a hidden gold wire, concealing the decay beneath. Public health, however, was another matter entirely. In Rome's crowded tenements, where water was scarce and diets were poor, tooth decay was rampant. Children suffered especially, their developing teeth attacked by sweetened wine and rough bread. Infections spread easily, and without access to physicians, many simply endured. The screams of someone having a tooth yanked out on a street corner were not shocking, they were part of the soundscape of the city, as ordinary as merchants shouting or chariots rumbling on stone streets. Even the Roman army, famed for its discipline and organization, could not escape dental misery. Soldiers marching across Europe and the Middle East carried with them the same bread, dried meat, and wine that wore down their teeth. Some archaeological finds suggest that dental problems were a leading cause of soldiers being declared unfit for duty. An infection could cripple a man more effectively than a wound. Military physicians likely performed extractions in camp, using the same iron forceps found in civilian contexts. In the silent hours of a Roman encampment, the moans of men with swollen jaws must have echoed like ghosts of invisible battles. The Roman world, for all its sophistication, remained helpless before the relentless decay of teeth. They recorded, experimented, and innovated, but without knowledge of bacteria, infection, or anesthesia, their efforts were limited. Relief was possible, but it was harsh, bloody, and often temporary. The tooth-worm myth of Mesopotamia may have faded, replaced by humoral theory and surgical tools, but the experience of pain remained much the same. And so, as you picture the grandeur of Rome, the Colosseum, the aqueducts, the marble forums, remember too the hidden reality. In the shadows of these monuments, countless men and women sat with their faces swollen, their mouths bleeding, their teeth pulled out in marketplaces, temples, and army camps. Pain did not discriminate between senator and slave, soldier and farmer. It gnawed at them all. Which raises a question as we close this first section: did Rome's obsession with order and control extend even to the chaos of dental pain, or did toothaches remain one of the few miseries that empire could never tame? In the previous section, we explored the harsh world of Roman dental pain, tooth pullers. In the marketplaces, Galen's humoral remedies, and the grim ingenuity of fillings made with toxic lead. Now, let's step deeper into the daily realities of Roman dentistry, how it intertwined with religion, military life, family customs, and even Rome's legacy after its fall. To begin, it helps to linger on the image of the Roman tooth puller. He was not a doctor in the modern sense, nor even a barber surgeon of the Middle Ages. Instead, he was a tradesman, often semi-itinerant, carrying his iron tools in a small chest. He might set up shop near a marketplace, a bathhouse, or the steps of a temple, calling out his services to those who could no longer bear the throbbing in their jaws. His tools were basic: forceps shaped like tongs, dental hooks to loosen stubborn roots, and sharp probes to test teeth. Extraction was brutal, but it was something people knew, expected, and even budgeted for in times of need. The act itself was theatrical. Imagine the scene: a patient sitting on a stool, gripping the edges, head tilted back as the tooth puller braces his knee against the man's chest for leverage. A crowd gathers, not out of cruelty, but curiosity, since public displays of pain were a familiar part of Roman life, from gladiatorial contests to executions. The tooth puller clamps the iron forceps onto the tooth, twists hard, and jerks it free with a snap. Blood sprays, the patient groans, and the crowd disperses, unfazed. Pain was not hidden in Roman society, it was endured publicly, almost ritualistically. Still, not all dental suffering ended with forceps. Many Romans turned first to remedies described by medical writers. Scribonius Largus, a Roman physician in the 1st century CE, recommended mixing peppercorns with vinegar and applying the paste to a sore tooth. Pliny the Elder suggested fumigating the mouth with the smoke of certain herbs or applying the ashes of burnt wolf teeth to the gums. Others advised cauterization, heating a metal instrument in the fire and pressing it against the aching tooth to burn away the nerve. The shock must have been excruciating, yet for some, it worked, at least until the infection returned. Religion remained another powerful avenue of hope. While Mesopotamians blamed the tooth worm, Romans appealed to their gods. Offerings were made to Apollo, Asclepius, and lesser household deities of health. Some wore amulets shaped like teeth, believing they held protective power. One inscription found in a Roman context reads, "For the pain in my teeth, I give thanks to the God who took it away." It does not tell us how the pain ended, whether through extraction, healing, or death, but it reveals how closely pain was tied to divine intervention in Roman thought. At home, families developed their own customs to manage pain. Mothers soothed children's teething with honey rubbed directly on the gums, a dangerous but common practice. Adults chewed on willow bark, unaware that it contained the chemical basis for aspirin. Vinegar, garlic, and onions were applied to sore spots, their sharpness believed to draw out the poison. Some families placed the extracted teeth of loved ones in jars, buried them in the ground, or offered them to the Lares, the household gods, as tokens of protection. The act of losing a tooth was not just physical, it was woven into the rituals of family life. The Roman army faced its own struggles. Soldiers were expected to march long distances, fight in battles, and maintain discipline. But something as simple as a tooth infection could incapacitate them. Records suggest that army physicians were trained to perform extractions, and archaeological digs at military camps have uncovered dental tools alongside surgical kits. Imagine a legionary, hardened by war, brought low not by an enemy spear but by a swollen, throbbing molar. In a tent on the edge of a battlefield, a camp physician presses hot metal against his jaw or yanks the tooth free. The soldier screams, but if he survives, he returns to his cohort, his mouth a little emptier, his body a little more battered. Teeth also carried symbolic weight in Rome. They were tied to beauty, vitality, and morality. Roman poets often mocked those with blackened or missing teeth, suggesting they were gluttonous, careless, or old. Martial, the satirist, once sneered at a woman who had a full set of teeth at age 80, because they were all false, carved from ivory. These jests reveal an undercurrent of anxiety about appearance, particularly among the elite. The wealthy sometimes paid for dental prosthetics, using gold wire to fasten replacements into their mouths. To smile with a full set of teeth was to display not just health but wealth. The ordinary people of Rome, however, could not afford such luxuries. Their smiles bore the marks of poverty, gaps where teeth had fallen out, dark stains from wine, and uneven wear from stone-filled bread. Their pain was endured quietly at home or noisily in the marketplace, but always as part of the fabric of life. No one expected to escape dental decay entirely. It was a fact of existence, much like taxes, war, and old age. As Rome expanded, its dental practices spread across the empire. In Britain, Gaul, and North Africa, archaeologists have uncovered Roman-style dental tools, suggesting that the trade of tooth-pulling traveled with the legions. Roman colonists brought not only Latin and architecture but also the crude art of extraction. Soldiers, merchants, and settlers alike endured the same tortures, carrying the culture of Roman dentistry into every corner of the known world. And yet, Rome also left behind something more enduring: written records. Medical texts from Galen, Celsus, Scribonius, and others preserved knowledge of dental treatments, however flawed, for future generations. These writings bridged the gap between ancient superstition and medieval practice. When the empire fell, tooth pullers did not disappear. They simply evolved, blending Roman methods with local traditions, laying the foundation for the barber surgeons of the Middle Ages. To step back, then, is to see Roman dentistry not as an isolated curiosity but as part of a larger story: how humans coped with the relentless misery of their own bodies. Pain was not hidden, nor was it treated with gentleness. It was endured, displayed, ritualized, and sometimes alleviated. Rome, for all its triumphs, could never conquer the human mouth. And so, as you reflect on the bustling streets of ancient Rome, the chariots rattling, the vendors calling, the marble gleaming in the sun, remember also the quieter sounds, the muffled groans of someone nursing a swollen cheek, the hiss of hot iron pressed against an aching tooth, the scream of a soldier as his molar is yanked free. This was as much a part of Rome as triumphal arches and legions. It leaves us with a haunting question as we pause here: did Rome's great legacy lie only in its monuments, or also in the survival strategies its people developed to endure life's smallest yet sharpest miseries? We have followed Roman dentistry from its bustling marketplaces to the homes of aristocrats, from the battlefield tents of legionaries to the temples where prayers for healing were whispered. Now, in this final section, we turn to the broader consequences of Roman dental practices, the cultural meaning of teeth, the survival of Roman medical knowledge after the empire's collapse, and the lingering question of whether Rome ever truly tamed the misery of toothache. Consider the Roman obsession with appearances. Teeth, as we have seen, were more than functional tools, they were symbols of health, beauty, and social worth. The wealthy used powders of crushed shells and bones to polish their smiles. They experimented with prosthetics, wiring loose teeth in place with gold. They sought to preserve their appearance even as their bodies aged and their mouths decayed. In Roman satire, bad teeth became an easy mark of ridicule. Writers mocked women for false smiles and men for gaps that betrayed age or gluttony. The pressure to maintain an attractive mouth reflects something fundamental. Even in a world without modern cosmetics or orthodontics, the smile was already a battlefield of identity. This preoccupation was not limited to elites. In the crowded tenements of Rome, where families lived stacked in insulae, apartment blocks that sometimes rose 5 stories, teeth told their own social story. Missing or rotten teeth marked poverty, malnutrition, and neglect. A child with blackened teeth revealed a diet heavy in sweetened wine or spoiled grain. An older worker with gaps and infections signaled years of chewing coarse bread. In this way, mouths became silent records of class, diet, and survival. To meet someone's gaze was also to see their teeth, and thus to glimpse their history. The persistence of toothache also forced Romans to develop communal strategies for endurance. Families shared remedies, from garlic pastes to fumigations of herbs. Mothers passed down recipes for powders and rinses, many of which would survive into medieval Europe. Communities also absorbed the spectacle of dental pain into public life. The sight of a man having his tooth yanked out in a marketplace was not shocking, it was a performance of resilience, one more example of how Romans confronted suffering directly, even publicly. Pain, in Rome, was rarely private. We should pause here and reflect on how Roman dental practices mirrored broader Roman attitudes toward the body. The empire valued discipline, control, and endurance. Soldiers trained their bodies to march for days without complaint. Gladiators displayed their strength and agony before cheering crowds. Citizens attended public punishments where pain was turned into spectacle. Dentistry, too, was shaped by these values. To lose a tooth in public, to endure an extraction without flinching, was to participate in the Roman ideal of fortitude. The mouth became another arena where self-mastery was tested. And yet, even the most disciplined Roman could not escape infection. The medical writers of the time knew this well. Celsus, a Roman encyclopedist, described the stages of dental disease: swelling, fever, the loosening of teeth, the foul taste of pus. He recognized that sometimes extraction was the only solution. But he also warned of the dangers of cutting too deeply, of breaking the tooth, of leaving fragments behind. His words remind us that even the most careful procedures were risky, often leaving the patient worse off. When the empire eventually fractured in the 5th century CE, Roman dental practices did not vanish. Instead, they were carried forward into the Middle Ages, adapted by barber surgeons and folk healers. The iron forceps of Rome became the tongs of medieval tooth pullers. The herbal remedies of Scribonius Largus were copied and recopied in monastic manuscripts. Even the superstitions, the frog amulets, the whispered prayers, persisted in new forms. Rome, in this way, bequeathed not only aqueducts and roads but also the raw, bloody art of tooth pulling. But perhaps the most enduring Roman contribution lay in its written records. The survival of Galen's texts ensured that humoral theory dominated medicine for over 1,000 years. Though flawed, these writings created continuity. They gave later physicians a framework for understanding dental pain, however misguided. Without them, medieval Europe might have had to reinvent these crude practices from scratch. Instead, the Roman voice echoed through the centuries, shaping how countless generations endured the misery of their mouths. It is tempting to imagine that Roman elites, with their gold dental wires and polished tooth powders, escaped this misery. But archaeology tells a different story. Excavations of aristocratic tombs reveal the same cavities, abscesses, and worn enamel seen in poorer graves. Wealth may have bought temporary relief, but it could not change the basic fact: Roman diets, tools, and medical knowledge left everyone vulnerable. In this, dental pain was one of the few equalizers of the empire. Senator and slave alike knew the taste of blood in the mouth, the searing pain of infection, the dread of the forceps. So what do we make of Roman dentistry in the end? On one hand, it was brutal, primitive, and deeply flawed. It offered little true cure, only extraction, pain, and ritual. On the other hand, it represented progress. Romans documented their experiences, experimented with materials, and passed down knowledge. They moved a step away from the tooth-worm myths of Mesopotamia toward a more systematic, if still mistaken, understanding of dental disease. They taught later generations that even the smallest, dullest pains were worth recording, worth studying, worth enduring. Now picture Rome at twilight. The streets grow quiet as lamps are lit. Families gather in cramped apartments or grand villas. Somewhere, a man presses a rag soaked in vinegar against his jaw. A woman sips wine mixed with herbs, hoping to sleep despite the throbbing in her gums. In a market stall, a tooth puller cleans his iron forceps, wiping away the blood of the day's work. And in the forum, marble statues gleam, immortalizing emperors who, like their subjects, once endured the same torment of aching teeth. Rome conquered nations, built monuments, and shaped laws that still echo today. Yet it could not conquer the human mouth. Its people lived and died with the same dull, grinding agony that had plagued Mesopotamians centuries before. And so, as this story of Roman mouths closes, a final question lingers: if an empire as powerful as Rome could not master something as small as a tooth, what does that tell us about the limits of human control over the body? The Roman Empire had left behind its forceps, its humoral theories, and its crude remedies. But when Europe entered the Middle Ages, dentistry became something stranger, darker, and at times more terrifying. This was not a period of systematic medical progress. Instead, it was a world where pain was endured with resignation, where superstition mingled with practicality, and where the dentist was often not a physician at all, but a barber, a blacksmith, or a wandering tooth puller. To lose a tooth in the Middle Ages was not only to suffer, it was to submit yourself to an experience that resembled a kind of everyday torture. To understand medieval dentistry, you must imagine the barber-surgeon. This figure straddled professions, cutting hair one moment and pulling a tooth the next. His shop was marked by a striped pole, the origin of the barber pole you still see today, which symbolized both blood and bandages. Inside, the tools of his trade were displayed: razors for shaving, knives for bloodletting, and iron tongs for extractions. The barber-surgeon was often the only accessible medical practitioner in a town or village, and though his training was minimal, his services were indispensable. When a patient arrived complaining of toothache, the barber-surgeon rarely hesitated. There were no X-rays, no drills, no anesthesia. The diagnosis was simple: if a tooth hurt badly enough, it was to be removed. The patient was seated, sometimes in an ordinary chair, sometimes in a special high-backed chair with armrests, which would later be likened to the torture chair. Assistants or family members might pin the patient's arms and legs to prevent thrashing. Then the barber surgeon applied his iron forceps, twisted, and pulled. The sound was sickening: the creak of bone, the snap of root, the muffled scream of the victim. But before the forceps, other remedies were often tried. The Middle Ages inherited the humoral theories of Galen, so toothache was blamed on an imbalance of the body's fluids. Treatments included bloodletting, purging, or cauterization. A painful tooth might be touched with a red-hot iron, or doused in vinegar, or rubbed with crushed herbs. One widely recommended cure involved placing a roasted onion, filled with caraway and cumin seeds, directly on the tooth. Others advised tying a live frog to the patient's jaw, or placing a dead mouse against the gums to draw out the poison. These practices reveal the mix of superstition and desperation that defined medieval medicine. Religion also played a profound role. The idea of the tooth worm, a tiny creature gnawing at the root of a tooth, persisted into the Middle Ages. Charms and prayers were invoked to expel it. Manuscripts include incantations such as, "Worm, worm, little worm, come out of the marrow, come out of the bone." Pilgrims carried relics of saints believed to cure toothache, and chapels displayed offerings of teeth left behind in gratitude for healing. The cult of Saint Apollonia became especially significant. According to legend, she was martyred by having her teeth violently broken, and so she became the patron saint of those suffering dental pain. People prayed to her for relief, carried her image, and dedicated chapels in her name. Even today, in Catholic tradition, Saint Apollonia remains a figure associated with dental health. The marketplace, too, remains central to the dental experience. Wandering tooth pullers traveled from town to town, setting up in public squares. Their work was theatrical. They wore bright clothing, called out to crowds, and offered free performances, sometimes pulling the tooth of a volunteer without charge, just to demonstrate their skill. Then they sold their services to paying customers. These men were part entertainer, part torturer. They thrived on spectacle, knowing that the sight of a successful extraction could convince others to endure the same agony. Tooth pulling was not always safe. Infections were common, and without antibiotics, they were often deadly. An abscessed tooth that was incompletely removed could lead to sepsis, swelling of the neck, and eventual suffocation. Medieval chronicles rarely mention dental deaths directly, but skeletal remains tell the story: jaws riddled with abscesses, teeth worn down to the roots, bones deformed by infection. For many, dental disease was a slow, painful decline that ended only with death. And yet, amid the brutality, there were also signs of progress. Medieval manuscripts record recipes for tooth powders made from sage, mint, and salt, which served as primitive toothpaste. Chewing sticks, splinters of aromatic wood, were used to clean between the teeth. Wealthier households imported spices like cloves, whose oil provided temporary relief from pain. By the late Middle Ages, some surgeons began experimenting with more careful methods of extraction, as well as treatments designed to save teeth rather than destroy them. These were small steps, but they hinted at the possibility of gentler dentistry to come. Still, for the average villager, the experience was stark. Imagine sitting in a crowded square, the barber surgeon's assistant gripping your shoulders as the iron tongs clamp down. You taste blood, you hear bone crack, and the crowd cheers as the tooth is held aloft like a trophy. Relief floods in, but so does exhaustion, and sometimes infection. This was the reality of medieval dentistry: relief bought through pain, survival through suffering. In the end, the Middle Ages made dentistry a public spectacle, a mixture of religion, superstition, and crude practicality. Teeth were reminders of sin, decay, and mortality, but also of endurance and community. The torture chair was not a place of healing so much as a stage where human resilience was tested. And so we pause here with an open question: in an age when medicine was so entwined with faith and fear, did medieval people truly believe they were healing their mouths, or were they simply learning to accept pain as part of life itself? In the first section, we stepped into the bloody marketplace of medieval dentistry: barber surgeons wielding forceps, frog charms tied to swollen jaws, and Saint Apollonia's cult offering spiritual relief where medicine could not. Now, let us deepen this story by exploring how dental suffering shaped daily medieval life, at the hearth, on the battlefield, in monasteries, and even at royal courts. We begin with the home. For most medieval people, toothache was an ordinary affliction. Mothers and grandmothers knew countless home remedies, passed down by word of mouth. Salt was the most common. Mixed with vinegar, it was rubbed directly onto gums, the sting meant to drive out corruption. Garlic cloves were chewed raw or roasted, their pungent oils thought to ease pain. Honey, despite being sticky and potentially worsening decay, was smeared on sore spots to soothe. Some households burned rosemary or juniper in the fire, then directed the smoke into the patient's mouth. Others boiled herbs in ale, sage, mint, or chamomile, then used the warm brew as a rinse. These practices may seem quaint, but they show how central the family was to managing pain long before professional help was sought. In more desperate cases, families turned to folk magic. Children's milk teeth were sometimes buried under the hearth, offered to protective spirits in hopes that strong adult teeth would grow. Amulets were hung around children's necks, carved from animal teeth or shaped like crosses, intended to guard against tooth worms. Charms were whispered at night: as the moon wanes, so may this pain. Such rituals reveal that dentistry in the Middle Ages was never only about the body, it was about the spirit, the family, and the unseen forces people believed governed health. The medieval diet also shaped dental misery. Unlike in Rome, where sugar was scarce, the later Middle Ages saw increasing imports of sugar from the East. At first, it was a luxury, consumed by nobles and royalty. But even before sugar became widespread, teeth were already under siege from coarse bread filled with grit from stone-ground flour. This wore enamel down to the roots. Peasants gnawed on tough meats and drank ale daily, further stressing their teeth. By the time sugar began flowing more freely in Europe during the 13th and 14th centuries, mouths were already vulnerable, and cavities spread with alarming speed among the wealthy. Thus, bad teeth became not only a mark of poverty but also a peculiar sign of privilege. On the battlefield, toothache could be a crippling affliction. Soldiers endured hunger, exhaustion, and wounds, but a festering abscess in the jaw could leave even the bravest knight incapacitated. Chronic pain might make a bowman miss his shot or a swordsman falter in his swing. Chroniclers rarely wrote about dental suffering, focusing instead on glory and defeat, but skeletal remains of medieval warriors reveal abscesses, severe wear, and missing teeth. In some cases, battlefield surgeons, the same men who stitched arrow wounds, also pulled teeth, often with crude pliers or even daggers. Imagine a knight, his armor battered, his body aching from combat, kneeling not before an enemy but before a surgeon gripping his jaw with iron tools. This too was part of war. Monasteries preserved a different side of medieval dental care. Monks copied ancient texts, including those of Galen and Celsus, keeping alive the humoral theories that guided treatment. In monastic infirmaries, remedies were recorded with care, poultices of herbs, rinses of wine, and prayers to saints. Some monasteries cultivated medicinal gardens specifically for such uses. The rule of Saint Benedict emphasized care for the sick, so monks attempted to relieve suffering with both faith and learning. Yet even here, extraction remained the ultimate solution, and silence cloaked the cries of patients whose molars were wrenched free. At the other end of society, the royal courts turned dentistry into a matter of status. Wealthy nobles commissioned powders and rinses imported from distant lands, cloves from the Spice Islands, cinnamon from Ceylon, myrrh from Arabia. These substances masked pain and freshened breath, becoming luxury goods as much as remedies. Queen Elizabeth I of England, centuries later, would famously suffer from blackened, decayed teeth caused by her love of sugar. But even earlier, medieval nobles displayed smiles ruined by luxury diets. In portraits, artists sometimes softened these realities, painting rulers with lips closed or subtly idealized features. Yet behind the courtly veneer, royalty endured the same agonies as peasants, proof that dental pain was one of the few equalizers of the medieval world. The marketplace tooth pullers we met in Section 1 remained central, but their craft grew increasingly theatrical over the centuries. They carried drums and trumpets to announce their arrival, promising miraculous cures for toothache. Some claimed to possess secret powders or oils that could banish pain. Others invoked saints or muttered charms before yanking out a tooth. These performances were half medicine, half spectacle, designed to draw a paying crowd. The tooth puller's success depended as much on showmanship as on skill. And yet, despite the risk of infection and death, desperate people lined up. Pain had a way of silencing caution. By the 14th and 15th centuries, dentistry was slowly professionalizing. University-trained physicians began to write more systematically about oral health, though they often considered it a lesser branch of medicine. Surgeons developed new tools, elevators and pelicans, the ancestors of modern forceps, to extract teeth with slightly more precision. But these refinements were rare, available only to the wealthy or those near cities. For the majority, dentistry remained brutal, public, and deeply entangled with superstition. To understand the endurance required, imagine again. The torture chair. A villager sits trembling, bound by family members. The barber surgeon grips the pelican, its beak-shaped end pressed against the tooth. He levers it upward, the patient shrieking as the bone creaks and finally breaks free. The crowd gasps, the surgeon triumphantly displays the tooth, and the patient slumps in agony and relief. This was both cure and performance, healing and torment. And yet, there was resilience in this ordeal. Medieval people did not expect a life free of pain. They expected hardship, hunger, and disease. Dental agony was one more burden to be borne, one more trial to endure with faith and patience. Prayers to Saint Apollonia, charms whispered under the breath, or the community gathered in a marketplace, all helped transform private suffering into something communal, even meaningful. As we close this section, we are left with a pressing thought: did the endurance of medieval dentistry, the acceptance of agony as ordinary, shape a culture that valued suffering itself as a kind of spiritual discipline? We have wandered through the homes, marketplaces, monasteries, and courts of the Middle Ages, seeing how people lived with their aching mouths. Now, in this final section, we turn to the closing chapters of medieval dentistry, the tools, the spectacle, the lingering superstitions, and the way this era prepared the ground for the dentistry of the Renaissance and beyond. The image of the barber-surgeon's shop remained central. The striped pole outside, its red and white spirals representing blood and bandages, was a sign not just of haircuts but of minor surgery. Inside, the torture chair was no metaphor. Patients were held down, their heads forced back as iron tools pried at swollen gums. On the table nearby, instruments clinked, razors, scalpels, cups for bloodletting, and, most fearsome of all, the dental pelican. The pelican, introduced in the late Middle Ages, was named for its resemblance to the bird's beak. Its curved metal arms grasped the tooth at the gum line, while the handle allowed the surgeon to lever it upward. Compared to earlier tongs, the pelican gave more control, but it also crushed surrounding gums and bone in the process. A single extraction could leave the jaw bruised for weeks. Yet it was seen as progress, a step toward precision in a brutal art. By the 15th century, another tool emerged, the dental key. Looking like the key to a door, it hooked around the tooth and was twisted sharply, often breaking the root in the process. Though it caused horrific fractures, it would remain in use well into the 18th century. These innovations remind us that medieval dentistry, for all its roughness, was evolving. Pain was still inevitable, but the instruments reflected attempts, however clumsy, to improve outcomes. The public side of dentistry grew ever more theatrical. Tooth pullers staged elaborate shows in town squares. They dressed in bright costumes, hired musicians, and promised miraculous cures. A man might declare he could cure not just toothache but headaches, earaches, and even melancholy, all with one extraction. To prove his skill, he might remove a tooth in front of a jeering, cheering crowd. For a few moments, dentistry was entertainment, a break from the monotony of daily labor. But for the patient in the chair, the performance was agony. Superstition lingered, too. The belief in the toothworm persisted deep into the Middle Ages, reinforced by charms, prayers, and folk cures. Some manuscripts even depict tiny worm-like creatures coiled around teeth, gnawing at the roots. Remedies promised to kill the worm, often by fumigation, holding a heated mixture of herbs or sulfur beneath the mouth so the smoke would drive it out. In truth, the smoke may have offered temporary numbness, but the worm never left, because it was never there. And yet, this idea endured, reminding us of how powerfully myths shaped the medieval body. Religion framed dental suffering in profound ways. Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of toothache sufferers, became a figure of deep devotion. Pilgrims visited her shrines, prayed before her relics, and left offerings of extracted teeth. To invoke her was to connect one's private agony to a holy narrative of martyrdom. Suffering was not only tolerated but sanctified, seen as a means of sharing in Christ's passion or the endurance of the saints. In this sense, dental pain became more than medical, it was spiritual discipline. Despite this, knowledge was not stagnant. Monks copied ancient texts and medical manuals, preserving Roman and Greek thought. Some university-trained surgeons began to record more careful observations. In Salerno, Montpellier, and Bologna, early medical schools debated treatments for oral disease. They described scaling tartar, rinsing with wine, and even attempting to preserve teeth rather than simply pull them. These were small, fragile shoots of progress breaking through the soil of tradition. Meanwhile, aristocratic households experimented with luxury dental care. They imported powders made of ground coral, pearls, and precious spices to whiten their teeth. They chewed cloves for fresh breath. They commissioned physicians to design elaborate rinses with wine and herbs. Yet for all their wealth, they could not escape decay. Excavations of medieval skeletons, even among elites, reveal mouths riddled with cavities, abscesses, and missing teeth. Sugar, that new indulgence, was as much a curse as a delight. By the late Middle Ages, the divide between folk healers and trained surgeons was widening. Barber surgeons continued their bloody extractions in town squares, but university surgeons began to see dentistry as part of legitimate medicine. The two worlds coexisted uneasily, one noisy, public, and theatrical, the other quieter, cloaked in Latin texts and scholarly debate. This tension set the stage for the Renaissance, when dentistry would slowly emerge as a specialized art, but for ordinary medieval people, little changed. Their experience of dentistry remained one of endurance. In the quiet of the home, families tried herbs and charms. In monasteries, monks prayed as they wielded iron tools. In bustling squares, tooth pullers made agony into spectacle. Across Europe, from peasants in their fields to kings in their castles, toothache was a constant reminder of the body's fragility. So what was the legacy of medieval dentistry? On one hand, it was brutality, superstition, and suffering. On the other, it was resilience, community, and continuity. The pelican and the key, crude as they were, marked steps toward modern tools. The manuscripts of monks preserved fragments of ancient knowledge. The prayers to Saint Apollonia gave comfort when nothing else could. Out of this blend of torture and tradition, dentistry as we know it would eventually emerge. Now picture the scene once more. A medieval square at dusk, torches flicker, musicians play, and a barber surgeon raises a freshly pulled tooth to the crowd. The patient slumps in the chair, pale and shaking, but alive, and, for the first time in weeks, relieved of pain. Around him, neighbors whisper charms, children clutch amulets, monks in distant cloisters copy texts by candlelight, and nobles in their halls sip sweetened wine that will rot their teeth anew. This was the medieval mouth, a place of torment, resilience, and faith. And so we end with a final reflection: was medieval dentistry truly about healing, or was it about teaching people to endure, turning the smallest torments of the body into reminders of faith, community, and the limits of human power over pain?